What's up, everybody? What's up, Craig? Welcome to the 2024 January 12th episode of Why Am I Like This? A container offered in the Broom, which is a radio of sorts, and which has a podcast, which you may be listening to right now. And today it's a Venus Day in Perth, Australia, where I'm based for the time being. It's a moon night of Jupiter Day in the USA, and probably also in most of Europe. And why am I like this? If you've never tuned in before, is a container which I used to offer in a lineage space, which I call seeds of seeds of seeds of life, or 000, but now lives in the Broom. And this is a container where I hold a portal for channeling responses to questions which have been posed to me in different forms of media. And I channel my vaster self, who I know as Nobu the Elder, or Red Star Green Cloud, or Sirius C. And the question which I've sort of intuitively navigated towards today comes from a member of the pot, a longtime member of the Broom, named Lexi. And the question is, what are your experiences with art, cooking, and clothes? Which, what I was saying, is a very Venusian-facing question, which is very true. I'd say like the Red Star and Red Star Green Cloud is very Venus-coded. And before I get started, I will repeat the guarantee slash disclaimer of this container, which I normally talk about, which is that I guarantee that no contexts will be enmeshed in this container, and I guarantee that contexts will be disenmeshed, and that I will hold space for refinement, feedback, critique of anything that's channeled within this container or the container itself. If you're not sure what I mean when I say that context will be disenmeshed and that no context will be enmeshed, I'm basically talking about karma. So what I'm trying to say is that karma will be released and karma will not be accumulated. And I think depending upon your definition of karma, that's probably going to feel more or less aligned. Some people would argue that as long as time is passing linearly forward, then karma is being accumulated. But I feel like at a level of abstraction, you can imagine that there are actions which create more karma versus allowing for the reifying of existing karma. And that's what I would say aligns most closely with the idea of context being enmeshed. And to disenmesh context would be to release karma such that it does not continue reifying. And if you all have any questions or refinements related to that, please chime in either in text or you can unmute and speak if you're in the container live right now. I would say like this is a big part of what makes the Broom a radio station, is that we don't just, right now at least, we don't record these sessions in a little cube. And I would say like the amount of editing we apply to them is very light, mostly for the purposes of audibility. But I would say for me, it's very important to capture the space and time of each of these sessions. And I wouldn't say bring them to life, but preserve the life in them, which I would say is like quite different to a podcast. And which is why the Broom Radio podcast is what some of us in the Broom have called an archival playlist of the live sessions that take place in the Broom. So before I answer the question, I'm going to make a little transmission of light language on the topic of I guess it's what's coming up is bubbling sound, whatever that means. I guess we'll find out. And I bring forth this light language transmission from the being I know as Nobu the Elder, and I only allow what is for the cosmic time of the One. And I'll start now. Shipatatamatukorakatamanah. Aleph sumatunanata. Huftanamatatinamuduk. Tinamataramatuftamasten. Tilepataramatukanandit. Shadanamataratatinamas. Lapasumatukanandika. Katatamanekadarek. Sianaman andien ston. Shinemad afteminakutora. Anenataraptakadamas. She arepetanaftapam. She arepetanamanora. She enemenarapatukanam. She arepetatanamatasu. She enemen etiftepetroman. She arepakanamanapaseftaman. Titetimenankadele koda. Ni anamastamanatakanimetotamanapase. Ti anamatakane. She anamanakotaparamasta. She patamanakotanasa. She anematakodamatona She anamastaftamanam. She anamastaftamanarakate. Ma anena kotapananakatifte. Ti anetaramatukanamasuta. Ti animat anepelorka. Ti teman olitakonamaste. Kiele anamanast. Shiteman appearance. Shiteman anapatukanama. She animasta. She animasta ita. She animasta inema. She animasta anama. She animasta ilit. She animasta pum. She animasta kanama. She animasta katanema. She animasta katatora. She animasta panana. She animasta anak. She animasta ilit. She animasta oniel. She animasta mitra. She animasta Allah. She animasta Prometheus. She animasta Kronos. She animasta Saturn. She animasta Anubis. She animasta Nobu. She animasta Shia Namaste. Shia Namaste. Shia Namaste. Shia Namaste. Shia Namaste. Shia Namastalakum. Shia Namastam. Shia Namastali. Shia Namastali Kamaso. Shia Namasam Bharatam. Shia Namastam Matatam. Kitanam. Shia Namastam Mataramata. Kitanamasa. Shia Namastam Matar. Tiiramas. Shia Namastam Andim. Tiana. Shia Namastapananda Katsa. Tile. Shia Namasta Umsilata. Kukana. Shia Namasta Umstarata. Kitana. Shia Namastapanandita. Shupara. Shia Namastapadamadakai. Tianama. Shia Arapatamat Arapatakamat Uttanamasata. Kitana. Shia Namastaparamatakandamasayata. Titana. Shia Namastaparapatanama. Anaka. Shia Namasaftamaruka. Kiyata. Shia Namasamadorata Tile Panamasami. Tikadam. Anamanara Saftapatalamana Sapatapandarapatatam. Tita Namastakataramasa. Titen Ostarapatakanampate. Titen Manarasaftapataripatakatamana. Shira Masaftapanalamakatena. Shira Masaftapatanamatakatanatsai. Tieri Shaftamataramatakanama. Tile Kanamasupanamashta. Tile Patanamasupada. Tai. Kianamasa. Tai. Kianamaso. Tai. Kianamaso. Shiate. Mula. Ginai. Tai. Thai, 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 Thai. Cool. Thank you for being patient. I'm going to repeat the question, which is, what are your experiences with art, cooking, and clothes? Well, I feel like the first thing that comes up for me with this is like, I'm not going to talk about all of my experiences with art, cooking, and clothes because there are lots of different experiences I've had with art, cooking, and clothes. And I don't feel like it would be expedient to talk about all of them. So I'm going to like meditate on the question behind the question, some people say sometimes. And I feel like the question behind this question is basically like, honestly, I'll say that my feeling is that the person who asked the question felt like there was something that they could learn in order to advance spiritually through me talking about my experiences with art and cooking and clothes. But please disagree, Lexi. So I feel like the question behind the question for me is, how have your experiences with art, cooking, and clothes helped you to advance spiritually? Does that make sense? Okay, I get a response of yeah, that aligns. Um, hmm. Well, I feel like what I'm being called to point to is a common thread between these three topics. And I would say that that thread has been wound by the commonality of all of these things relating to the material realm. I would say that another part of that winding is the commonality of these topics as being related to aesthetics. And then I would say for me, a commonality between these topics is that they relate to self expression. And another commonality for me is that all of these topics relate to a somewhat fluid relationship between being a producer and a consumer of art and cooking and clothes. One more commonality, which I don't think is necessarily very unique to me, but probably not common to all humans, is that art and cooking and clothes all feel like they are necessities for a human, or for this human, or for many humans. And I think that people are most likely to disagree with respect to art, because I would say a lot of people don't necessarily appreciate either the process of making art or the process of consuming art. I think people who are really into the raw food movement might argue that cooking is not completely necessary, but I would disagree. I think most foods require some level of cooking in order for their nutrients to become easily bioavailable. And if they aren't cooked, then I would say our metabolism ends up cooking them and often ends up fairly inflamed or exhausted from the process of cooking them. And then, yeah, I would say like there are people in naturalist communities, sometimes less euphemistically known as nudists, who would argue that clothing is not necessary for all humans in all contexts. But I would say, for me, they're all considered necessities for me, and I will consider them necessities for the full spiritual development of most human beings. I also want to hold space for y'all to talk about the way you relate with art and cooking and clothes, or with any one of them. And I'll definitely be reading the chat if you don't feel like unmuting. Um, hmm. So the next thing that comes through for me is, um, yeah, I'll say like words relating to the relationship between self-expression and fulfilling basic necessities. Um, I would say that there is probably a mode of fulfilling basic necessities which could be said to be a self-expression, in the sense that there is a self moving, speaking, behaving in a shared consensus reality. Um, and this could be said to be a form of expression, but I feel like colloquially or in common time or in common tongues, when people talk about self-expression, they're referring to something which goes above and beyond what's purely necessary. I don't think that they're necessarily talking about performance, but I feel like the energetic dynamic of self-expression for most people in common time is one where spirit moves in the orchestration of their behavior or what they communicate. And a more concrete way of talking about this is that you could say that they're emotionally engaged with how they're behaving or communicating. Or a metaphysically more detailed way of talking about this would be to say that awareness is connected throughout their body, and they're not just going through the motions, so to speak, of necessity. And the next thing I'll say is that from this lens, one could argue that the difference between art and what is not considered art is the extent to which it orchestrates or causes the orchestration of awareness to expand in the body of the person who is receiving it, and or the person who is receiving it as they consume it, as they produce it, I should say. I would say when it comes to art, this distinction is like more highly contested and also more defined in a way that doesn't necessarily attend to the egregore of cooking or the egregore of clothing. But if I were to reframe the question and say, what are your experiences, or how have your experiences with art and cuisine and fashion shaped your spiritual progression, then I feel like if I talk about cuisine as opposed to cooking, then I feel like I'm exerting a similar level of particularity upon cooking as the word art exerts upon, I would say, like the material realm or aspects or experiences of the material realm. And then I would say, again, if I apply the word fashion to clothing, then that exerts a similar particularity. And then I would say in this arrangement, based on some people's definition of art, and definitely the definition that I just put forward, then cuisine versus cooking might be considered a subset of the dynamic of art versus life. And like fashion versus clothing might be considered also a child of that dynamic of art versus life. Which is to say that I think the common dynamic of particularization there relates to the proportion of self-expression versus necessity, and the proportion of awareness orchestration versus, you might say, like mechanical movement. And I feel like the way that I'm framing these things is starting to take the shape of a frame which might help me to explain how my experiences with art, cooking, and clothing have aided my spiritual progression. So I'm going to pause to look at the chat. Hoda says, yeah, it feels like all three are related in the sense that they reflect an aspect of myself that desires to be expressed. Poetry cafe snap. So having defined in a way which feels even by my standards, I would say contrived, not in a bad way. You could say like considered and lingeringly purposeful. Yeah, I think it's possible for me to continue along the track that's being laid. I think that what's coming through for me right now is that the relationship between self-expression and mechanical movement perhaps speaks to or can be easily aligned with the relationship between the mind and the body, using a definition of the mind which relates to the awareness that is produced by a body. And some people might say that there is no separation between mind and body. Um, and I can see alignment in that perspective because I think it's very difficult for a body to function without the orchestration of awareness. But I also feel like it's perhaps within people's grasp to understand that the body can function in a way that feels autonomous or which is not necessarily hydrated, let's say, with what we refer to as um, consciousness sometimes, or awareness, or sometimes when we're talking about a particularly pointed version of awareness, we might refer to it as intention. Um, but I guess like the word which comes up for me right now is gnosis. So the body can function without our gnosis of how it's functioning. And we can even, colloquially say that we can fulfill tasks that are required for us to survive um, mechanically. But I would say from a sort of concrete and sort of metaphysical perspective, you might say that we can do many things without being able to remember how we felt when we did them. And I feel like this is perhaps a useful working definition of what I mean when I talk about mind or being mindful, or when I talk about gnosis. And I think it also speaks to the previous words that I channeled about like self-expression relating to the orchestration of awareness within one's body, such that the experiences that a body of space and time has, or such that the experiences that the awareness of a body moving through space and time has, can be said to be remembered when there is sufficient orchestration of awareness that one might call self-expression on the earth. And so, given that the way that I'm defining the particularity of art with respect to living or life, and you could say that given the particularity with which I'm defining cuisine, colloquially, with respect to cooking, and fashion with respect to clothing, I feel like you could argue that all of living could be considered art, and all cooking could be considered cuisine, and all clothing could be considered fashion, with a particular orchestration of self-awareness, or beyond a certain threshold of self-awareness, which I'll call self-expression. And I'm feeling called to just pause there and see if anybody who's in the container right now wants to offer anything in reflection to what I'm saying. Oda says, I was meditating on that today. It's so subtle for me. I'd say right now it's like less subtle than it was before, colloquially speaking. But I would say that my sense of it is that in this container, my awareness is deeper in the subtlety or the metaphysics of it. And I feel like I'm probably going to go a little deeper before I feel satisfied about the level of clarity that I'm channeling on this topic. Holding space. Listening to a song that's playing in my heart. Oh, that's typing. And while I'm waiting, I'm just assembling the pieces which are coming in through my channel. It's so subtle for me, like how being or experiencing one's refined vessel can almost feel like being on autopilot. But when the mind and body's link is strong, the texture expresses or emanates differently, is my sense. That's from Hoda. Mm. Yeah, I think as I'm feeling into what you're saying, I can say that the way that I understand it is that when one is just channeling, it feels like the orchestration is happening beyond one's present life incarnation. Um, but I don't think that that necessarily means that it feels like the movements or the words or even like the awareness that is being channeled is like what I'm trying to gesture at when I talk about being mechanical, because I think, like you say, when the mind and the body's link is strong and that link is being, I would say, like fortified by what one is channeling and then also directed by what one is channeling, then the the orchestration of awareness allows for, I would say, an experience which is richer and which deepens that link between mind and body, which does tend to engage us emotionally. Um, and even if it's not suffused with like what we tend to associate with intention, which I would say, like when I'm talking about intention, at least in this context and in many contexts, I'm talking about a formal or conceptual or symbolic articulation of a direction which comes from within the present life vessel of a self. But I also feel like when one is channeling in the way that I feel like you're gesturing at, there is this vibration of purpose or meaning which arises from the orchestration of awareness or mind and its link to the body, even if there is not necessarily a symbolic or conceptual or formal knowing of what that purpose, direction, or meaning is navigating that present life vessel towards. But please disagree. Um, and while you're disagreeing or contemplating disagreement or just reflecting on what I was saying and how well it aligns with what you're saying, I guess I'll continue to talk about my experiences of art and cooking and clothing and how they relate to, I would say, like the formation of the gnosis that I've channeled so far, which is the latest artifact of my spiritual progression. And then maybe I'll talk about, on some more abstract level, how my experiences have informed my spiritual progression. But maybe I'll just leave it open for y'all to fill in the gaps between those experiences and this gnosis so that you don't follow at inappropriate levels of concreteness how my spiritual progression has progressed, but can instead reflect upon how my experiences have informed the present time artifact of my spiritual progression, and then have your awareness brought to, over time, your experiences of living or art or cooking or cuisine or clothing or fashion, such that you can have your own spiritual progression and produce artifacts of your spiritual progression which are unique to your spiritual progression. Hoda says what you shared tracks for me. Um, yeah, I'll say that before I really thought too deeply about the difference between art and living, or cooking and cuisine, and clothing and fashion, I just experienced material reality. And it's becoming a little bit clumsy for me to talk about my experiences across all these topics simultaneously and having to like linearize them. So I'll just say that like I recognize that there were pictures of reality or depictions of realistic scenes, which people called art. Um, I recognize that sometimes there were pictures which were made out of acrylic or oil paint, or they were in frames. And I recognize that those pictures were accorded more value by the people who owned them and sometimes by the people who gazed upon them. Um, but I would say that as I got older, it became more obvious to me that there were things that people referred to art, and there was art that people said was not art because it didn't meet, let's say, for most people, it didn't fit the patterns of what they thought deserved, in quotation marks, to be called art, or didn't fit the patterns of what they had seen as being accorded a certain level of value or a certain place in the hierarchy of objects produced by humans and organized by society, mostly according to capital and the taste levels of those who have more capital, whether that's social or financial or material. Um, and then I'd say that I studied art in high school for about 1 year, and it wasn't an art history class, it was basically an art studio class. And the only thing that happened is we went into a place which looked like an art studio, which had a lot of art supplies, and we were able to pull out art supplies, and then we just sat at tables with pieces of paper and then whatever art supplies we pulled out with very little direction. And we were just basically left there to draw or to talk or to do nothing. And that was probably the main reason I took that class, which is because it felt like a really nice break from classes which were a little heavier on curriculum and for which there was an expectation of having to sit a test and be assessed and either pass or fail and possibly repeat. And I have to say, like, I don't remember producing anything in that art class, but I know that I didn't fail, which, depending on how you look at things, could be seen as an indictment of that art class. Um, and then I would say, like, after that, most of my experiences with art relate to my sister having studied fine art, or I think what people call studio art in the United States at the university level. And when she went to study art at university, I would say, from my perspective, perhaps relative to most tertiary art curricula, there was a lot more theory versus practice than most, as far as I can tell, which led to arguments about the nature of art, what made art art, what made art valuable, what made it worthy of being considered art by, you could say, like the institutes which relate to defining what is worthy of being positioned by and funded by society. as art and what becomes part of the canon of artistic production of any given culture. And um, I guess I'm just going to like suggest or offer that you can take a container, you can visualize a container which relates to what I've been talking about with regard to societal or cultural artistic production and funding and selection of what is considered art as taken apart from life or taken apart from material objects relating to living. And then you can imagine in that container also the separation between what we tend to refer to as cuisine or restaurant quality food versus mere cooking, whether that's cooking for sustenance or cooking for enjoyment, or anything in between. And you can also visualize or gain gnosis of in that container all the ways in which we separate fashion from clothing. And then in another container, let's say to the left of that container, I would offer that you can gain gnosis of what I was talking about with regard to the particularity of art versus living, and the particularity of cuisine versus cooking, and the particularity of fashion versus clothing with respect to the metaphysical influence that these more particular forms have on the mind of any body which is positioned to receive art or life, or cuisine or cooking, or fashion or clothing. And then you can gain gnosis of the contrasts between these two containers. They'll hold space for reflection. But I'll say while I'm holding space for reflections that yes, it's possible, I think, for anybody to orchestrate awareness in their body such that their awareness produces gnosis, such that their awareness produces the ability to remember what one is experiencing in any given space and time and apply that to life in order to perceive life as art in a way that you could say orchestrates or reifies the orchestration of self-awareness in one's body such that gnosis is received. The same applies to eating or cooking versus doing things that what might be referred to as like restaurant quality cuisine, or with a culinary refinement that other people, by some definition of other people in some society, would refer to as like a higher level of culinary refinement. And the same could be said of dressing oneself, or observing how other people dress themselves, or observing articles of clothing in a store. You could say that, yeah, there is a way of orchestrating one's awareness such that one can experience one's own clothing or the process of dressing oneself or an article of clothing either on someone's body or not in a way that I would say like kindles that feeling of orchestrated awareness or gnosis or remembering, which could be said colloquially to be a form of appreciation, which I would say like musters one's life force and makes that experience feel meaningful, or makes it feel like that experience aligns with a purpose or a direction, which could be said to be divine or spiritual or led or guided. But I think it's also fair to say that most people in current time don't have the ability or haven't yet cultivated the ability to orchestrate the awareness or the mind of their body such that these experiences could be said to be, regardless of the intention or the vibration that was used to produce a material object or a piece of clothing or a meal, that, yeah, it could be said that most people in current time don't have the ability to approach or experience living or cooking or clothing in a way that feels divine or spiritual. Um, or you could say that most people don't have the ability in current time to experience a material object or a meal or a piece of clothing in a way that makes it feel as if the very act of perceiving or interacting with this object has the energy of self-expression, and that some objects are more likely to produce this energy of self-expression in a person, whether it's cooking or clothing or art. And then I would say that it's more likely that that person would define that object as art or cuisine, fine dining, or fashion, or adornment, let's say. I think I'm just sort of like pulling in words which tend to be used in a way that separates what some people might call the divine from the mundane, or what some people might simply call like well made versus, you know, common, or refined versus basic. And I guess what I feel like I'm being called to shine light on is the reality that when people have a certain level of refinement of awareness, that all of life can convey that energy of self-expression. And I would also say that when that level of self-expression is experienced, one might feel like there is a communion between oneself and the reality, quote, outside, unquote, oneself, and start to approach what I feel like some New Age people say when they say that they are the conscious creators of their own reality, but that there is like an interaction between the material reality and oneself, which produces this feeling of self-expression and this engagement of emotion and this engagement of purpose or meaning or being guided, which makes one feel like their experience is the result of a collaboration between their spirit and the spirit of all that is. And then I'm also shining a light on, I think, the reality that most people either haven't cultivated this ability or they don't have this ability easily at hand in all contexts, and that there are some objects, some meals, some forms of clothing which are more likely to result in this orchestration of self-awareness, which again feels spiritual or divine or led or emotionally engaging or meaningful in a way that allows one to remember that experience, in a way that perhaps that experience might fall into one's channel in a different context, in a time of need, in such a way that that memory of that experience might be able to help someone feel more spiritually connected or more engaged with living, regardless of the circumstances they find themselves in. And to bring this back to like my experience for a second, I would say that I've had many experiences of perceiving or receiving objects in my awareness which aided this orchestration of self-expression or awareness, or brought my mind and my body into integrity, I'll say, which other people didn't consider to be like artful. Um, I've had meals which other people probably wouldn't refer to as fine dining, which helped me into this energetic state of mind body integrity, which I've been talking about as self expression or as being meaningful or emotionally engaging. And likewise, I've experienced clothing that most people would not consider very fashionable or very refined, but perhaps sometimes in combination with the energy of the person who was wearing it or the way in which this clothing was displayed allowed me to come into some level of mind-body integrity, which I've been referring to as gnosis, or um, conducive to divine intimacy. And in that moment of feeling that way, I would say that I was expressing myself. Like in that moment of having that engagement with whatever object I was interacting with, I would say that that was an expression of self, not only because what I was experiencing of those objects, let's say, was different to what other people experience of those objects, and therefore could be said to be more of an expression of myself than it was of what other people experience. But because in that energetic state of mind body integrity, I would say that my selfhood was consolidated and felt more meaningful. And I think the same thing could be said when I was experiencing objects that other people considered to be like, let's say, artful or like fine dining or like refined clothing. And I didn't feel engaged in that way, even when I was in a state of mind body integrity. I could say that in those moments, I did not feel that my state of mind body integrity was influenced by the object that other people were experiencing as artful or fine dining or refined, which is one particularly intricate and you could say like obtuse way of saying that, what is art and what is not art is in the eye of the beholder, which is a little bit pat or glib. But hopefully, what I've channeled so far in this container speaks to my understanding or my perspective of the metaphysics which go into what um, I've been calling mind body integrity, and then the metaphysics of how an object or an experience, which might be considered art or might not be considered art, might come to be considered artful by any given body based on whether their mind body integrity is pre existing and enhanced by the experience of that object or that meal or that piece of clothing, or whether it's unmoved by the experience or even like negatively impacted by the experience of that object or that meal or that piece of clothing. And I think that it's totally natural based on anybody's, you know, present time karmic imprinting or spiritual conditioning that the same object or meal or piece of clothing might have a different impact on their level of mind-body integrity. And I'll only add before I close the container and or read out other people's responses that um, both cultivating one's mind-body integrity through practices like meditation, through practices like dhikr, through practices like prayer, through practices like dancing, tantra, self-tantra, etc., is one way, I think, of coming into a state of mind-body integrity in more context, in a more enduring fashion, such that we can feel like there is divinity or meaning or purpose in every experience that we have. But I'd also say that doing that plus exposing ourselves to what society considers to be artful or refined or fine dining, within one's capacity to pay for or have the time to indulge in those experiences in a state of cultivated mind body integrity can help us to refine our understanding of which objects or which meals or which pieces of clothing um, can bolster or influence us into states of what I'll just more simply call divinity for now, so that when perhaps our state of energy is not feeling super divine, we can accumulate more experience, which can help us to be guided towards art and food and clothing, which helps us towards states of divinity. And then I would say, like, through this practice collectively, we might be able to shift what we define as art or fine dining or fashion, perhaps like closer to the container where I define art and fine dining and fashion as being defined by the influence they have on our energetic states or our metaphysical orchestration of integrity, and further away from, let's say, mundanely being defined by the whims of those who happen to have more capital than other people. And that I feel like through this individual process of cultivating mind body integrity and applying it to experiences of living and eating and cooking and dressing and seeing other people and how they dress, then collectively our practice of producing and funding and I'd say like venerating objects of art or fine dining or fashion might evolve towards, I'll say, like, once again um, orienting us towards divinity versus merely reifying existing discrepancies of capital. Hmm. So I'm going to read out some of the text before I close the container. Adam says, what you said earlier about intention feels essential to this distinction across the spectrum of experience and enjoyment. And later, I love the drawing towards unique self-expression energy. Hoda says, I feel like clothes and music are two things that take my immersion with self-awareness to another octave. Feeling a little verklempt as I read that. Um, I'll read it again. I feel like clothes and music are two things that take my immersion with self-awareness to another octave when I'm available to tune into it. Beautiful to me. Totally can think of a few pizzas that are probably there too. I mean, listen, I made pizza for like 6 years professionally, and then I made pizza, like I tweaked pizza recipes, um, sometimes in very highly stressful environments, because I don't know if y'all have made pizza before, but sometimes you make the pizza like up to a day before you're about to bake it, and you're not sure how it's going to go, and all these people come to your house and they're like, is this even going to rise because I fucked with the formula in search of the perfect crust? Very stressful. But I'll say that, yes, some of the pizzas I've eaten out of the house, a lot of the pizzas I ate professionally, or I ate after producing professionally, were sublime because I had the good fortune to work at one of the most highly regarded pizza restaurants in my hometown. And then I'd say, like, yeah, about 40% of the pizzas I made myself lifted me to that level outside of the restaurant when I was tinkering, and honestly without a very high-powered oven. Um, yeah, there's some comments on divine intimacy, and Adam says, I keep feeling like a dance, the true union of all that is in one individual aspect of it. That's perfect. I feel like that aligns very well with what I felt like I was channeling and um, positioning in the geometry between these containers and within the geometry of those containers. Um, yeah, I think you set up really well. And it sounds like Adam had some really great pizza tonight as well. I think pizza is like a really great example of like something which, I think it's very hard to speak in only material terms of what makes a pizza like fine art versus basic. And some people might just say like the entire format of pizza as a food renders it as like almost entirely disqualified from the canon of fine dining, unless it was perhaps served in like a Michelin star restaurant in a way which is like formally provocative and or interesting, or using ingredients which are of a very rare variety or very expensive or just like very well spiritually cultivated. I think that you can have pizza which approaches fine art, which is made of very humble ingredients, which is served in very humble environments. And not just because your level of spiritual cultivation is very refined, but perhaps because the spiritual cultivation of whoever made that pizza or selected the ingredients or cultivated those ingredients from their relationship to the land is very refined, even if those people don't seem to be extrinsically very earnest spiritual practitioners. And I'm thinking of one of the guys, or a couple of the people who taught me how to make pizza, who are just like regular Aussie blokes, probably don't consider themselves to have any kind of spiritual practice, but at least in the context of pizza, I would say were very finely attuned to what was happening on material and spiritual levels. Adam says, cheese and bread alone can be art. 100%. Dang, that's beautiful. And now I'm thinking of some of the cheese and bread I've eaten at the table of my father and his partner, who is a Sicilian Australian. And yeah, those motherfuckers can cook, let me tell you. Or they can choose bread and cheese, and they can also produce a dining environment, which I think aids the orchestration of mind-body integration, spiritual cultivation, such that almost anything you put on that table could be experienced in a way that feels divine. And I'm feeling a little verklempt because I feel like um, producing a container where people can come together and eat and love is yeah, I think it's a form of divinity. Well, I might go cry a little bit, but I'm feeling like it's a good time to close the container. And I'll say, yeah, if you want to catch these containers live, make me cry through your offering, then you can join the Broom Discord, and the link should be in the show notes. And if you have questions that you would like for us to entertain and respond to in the container of Why Am I Like This, then you can come into the Discord and pose them to me in a channel called Why Am I Like This? Or you can just ask me this question anywhere. You can find me on Twitter, Instagram, Threads, Mastodon, whatever, WhatsApp, Signal. And I'll probably ask you if it's okay with you if I bring this question into the container. And you might surmise that in my adherence to a custom of asking permission to bring this question into this container, that there might be some level of metaphysical offering associated with that. Well, you don't have to think about it. But thank you so much for tuning in if you're tuning in asynchronously. Thank you even more if you're here live, because I would say that your awareness helps to juice this container, and I'm very grateful for what came through it. Thank you very much. Peace.